In this final lesson, we'll complete the core sample application for the Rails tutorial by adding a social layer that lets users follow and unfollow other users. As with the real-life Twitter website, this will let us construct a feed of the followed users' microposts, which should serve you well as you go on to develop your own applications with their own specific requirements. Let's start by creating a new topic branch. Because the material in this lesson is particularly challenging, let's take a look at a series of mockups showing the complete flow from page to page, so that we have a good idea of where we're going in this lesson. We'll start with a mockup of the final profile page. Note that it has a listing of the user's microposts. This is what we completed in the last lesson. We're also going to add some information here below the user's avatar and name, showing how many users that user is following and how many followers they have. Now suppose that our example user here, named John Calvin, wants to find a user to follow. He could then click on the link for all users to go to the user's index. Here he sees a number of different possibilities, including Thomas Hobbes, so suppose that he clicks on that. Now on Hobbes' profile, Calvin sees the same basic structure that he sees on his own profile, but he also sees a follow button. So if he clicks on that button, he should now be following Hobbes, so the number of followers is incremented. You can see how that works, from 144 to 145, and the follow button changes to an unfollow button. Finally, if Calvin navigates to the home page, he sees the interface for posting a new micropost that we created in the last lesson, as well as the section on user following and followers that we mentioned a couple of mockups ago. And then he sees a feed of the microposts of the users he follows, as well as his own posts. So here we can see Calvin sees his own, as well as Sasha Smith, who evidently he already followed, and then a couple of posts from Thomas Hobbes. In order to get all this working, our first task is to come up with a data model for this idea of one user following another. I'd like to note that this data modeling material can be pretty heavy going, and it's likely that you wouldn't be able to guess much of this from the start. If you find that it's getting confusing, I recommend pushing through and come back after we've built the web interface. I think it'll be a lot clearer the second time through. Now, the most straightforward way of doing this is to mimic the relationship we made in the last lesson, where we had a user that had many microposts. Here's the diagram for that data model. The idea is that we have a user whose ID is reflected in the user ID of the microposts, so each of these microposts would then be available as user.microposts. Now, we might be tempted to make something similar for the idea of followed users. So for example, we might have a followed users table with a follower ID and a followed ID, and here the follower ID reflects the ID of the user, and then we could say that a user has many followed users. If you think about it though, this design is terribly redundant, because each row here in the followed users table contains not only the followed user's ID, but all of the other information as well, the name, email, and so on, and that information is already in the users table. In addition, we also want to express the idea that a user has many followers, which would require another table of redundant information. And finally, if you think about it, this is a maintainability nightmare, because suppose that a user with ID 2 here changed his name, then we would have to change it not only in the users table, but also in this table and in the followers table. The way to solve this is to realize that we're missing an underlying abstraction. And one way of seeing this is to think in terms of the REST architecture. When one user follows or unfollows another user, think about what's getting created or destroyed. What's really happening there is that some relationship, a following relationship, is being created or destroyed between these two users. So the solution we'll adopt is to have a separate resource for the relationships between users. And as we'll see, this will let us write much more compact code for this idea of followed users and followers. Let's take a look at a diagram of that. In this diagram, we have relationships that sit between the user and the list of followed users. And you can see here how it works. The relationships table has a follower ID and a followed ID. The follower in this case has ID 1, and you can see that this lets us construct a list of followed users through the relationships table. So the way to read this is to follow the ID, and then pick out all the places where the follower ID is equal to 1, and then we construct a list of all the users with the IDs in the followed ID column. If you look at the very bottom here, you can see the kind of code this will lead to. This user here is just a description, but this is actually the code we'll have. So here a user has many followed users through the relationships table, and the source of those users is in the followed ID column. Let's create a Rails model that reflects this data model. We saw that the relationships table will have a follower ID and a followed ID, so let's do that. Let's take a look at it. So here's our migration with the follower ID and the followed ID and the usual timestamps. Now if you think about how we're going to use this, we're going to be pulling out all the followed users and the followers. These cases will involve pulling out all of the relationships with either a given follower ID or a given followed ID, which suggests putting an index on each of those columns. And there's one more thing about this data model that we want to express at the database level, which is that the relationships should be unique. That's to say, if a user is following another user, they can't follow them again. Of course, we'll be enforcing that at the user interface layer as well, but just for completeness, it's nice to have that at the database level. Recall how we did that with email. We have an index that's unique. So we can do the same thing here, except it's going to be a composite key. Recall that we saw a composite key in the case of microposts like this. So we just give it an array of follower ID and followed ID. Now it's possible that in some databases there's some redundancy here in the sense that you might only need this one add index, but I think it's best not to rely on that behavior. All right, let's run the migration. And I just realized I didn't actually make it unique, so let's roll it back. There we go. Good. Let's take a look at the relationship model. So by default, it's just empty, apart from this @accessible line. Now, even at this early stage, let's think about what should be accessible. When you follow a user, what you're going to be doing is creating a record with a followed ID in the database. That is to say, if you're user 1 and you click on follow on user 2, the application knows the ID of the follower, namely your ID, which means that we don't want the follower ID to be editable through the web. That information comes from the ID of the current user. So let's start by adding a test for that. We'll look at the relationship spec. We can go over here and look at the microposts. The micropost spec just for reference. The subject of this micropost test is the micropost. That suggests making a relationship that's the subject of this test. In the case of the original user spec, we used an instance variable. That was partially because I didn't want to introduce the idea of let so early in the tutorial. And then we used micropost, just an analogy with the @user. But we can actually use a let here as well. Let's see how that works. So we're going to create a relationship. Now for a relationship, we need a follower. We're going to build the relationship through the association. So based on this code, you can guess that the behavior is going to be very similar to user microposts, where we have user.micropost.build and then the content. In this case, we need the followed ID, which in this case we're going to call followed.id. Of course, this means that we'll need both a follower and a followed. Those are just both users. And the subject is relationship. Let's put in the usual sanity check for it should be valid. And then let's put in the test for accessible attributes. In this case, it should not allow access to follower ID. All right, let's prepare the test database. Now let's run the test here. All right, we can see that we're failing. That's for several reasons. One is that we still have follower ID on this list. Let's get rid of this. All right, now we have only one failure, which is a good sign. It says undefined method relationships. And this is because we haven't yet set up the associations between users and relationships. The way to get that to work is to note that users have many relationships. So let's put that in. Now, in the case of microposts, Rails knows that we want the foreign key to be user ID by default. That is, in this diagram, if we omit any indication of what this foreign key is, it's automatically just the name of the table singularized, then with _ID added. In this case, the user has many relationships, but the foreign key is follower ID, as we can see here. So we have to tell that to Rails explicitly. And as with microposts, we want relationships to disappear if the parent user is destroyed. Writing a test for this is left as an exercise. All right, so that was our user spec, which is now passing. Let's run this here. Good. So if you get stuck with this, just compare the association between users and microposts and users and relationships. They're almost exactly the same except for this foreign key. And in both cases, they give rise to this build method, which we can use through the association. Let's look at the micropost model again. Recall that a micropost belongs to user, which gives rise to a micropost.user method that just returns the user associated with the given micropost. In the case of relationships, each relationship object is naturally associated with two different users, the follower and the followed. So let's put that in. So it should respond to follower, the subject, that is to say, the relationship. And its follower should equal this variable here, the follower here. And its followed user should be the followed here. Let's run these. So in the micropost model, we have belongs to user. In the relationship model, we'll have belongs to follower and belongs to followed. Now in the case of the micropost, when we say belongs to user, by default, Rails knows to use the class user here, just from the name of the symbol here. But in this case, there is no follower model or followed model. The whole point of the way we're doing things is that we don't have to create new models for those. We can just use the user model. But in this case, we do have to tell Rails what the name of the class is. Let's run that and see if it works. There we go. By the way, as we'll see, we won't actually need this relationship, this followed relationship, until later in this lesson. But I think it's easier to see what's going on when we develop the two things in parallel. Before actually constructing a working list of followed users, let's add a couple quick validations to these relationships. Oops, we should write test first. There we go. We come now to the heart of the relationship associations, namely making a list of followed users and making a list of followers. We'll start with the idea of followed users. A user should respond to followed users. We can get this to work by putting a has many here. All right, it passes, so let's break this down. This is our first example of a has many through relationship. And indeed, the main reason we need this relationships table and this has many relationships is so that has many through works. Let's take another look at our diagram. So here's our diagram again. I actually realized there was a slight mistake. Before we had source followed ID, and that's actually wrong. And what's going on here is that the source here refers to the source in the relationship model. So let's take a look at that. So this here belongs to followed, means that we can give this has many through a source corresponding to that name. The reason we need this here is because if we left it off, Rails would look for followed user over here. Now we could do followed user. We could say belongs to followed user. The problem with that is that the symmetric construction would then be to say follower user, which sounds really strange to me. So we've adopted the terminology that we're going to have many followed users, but the price we pay for that is that we have to explicitly identify the source. Another possibility would be to say has many followeds. Then we wouldn't need this source followed. In fact, let's run this. It should work. If we change this to followeds. So that actually works, but that just doesn't sound good. So we're going to say followed users here and have source followed and followed users. Oops, we need to save everything. There we go. Now at this point I want to make a couple of utility methods. This is the kind of thing where you might want to rely on the mockup to think in terms of what are we going to be doing under the hood. The idea is we're going to be clicking on a follow button. So it would be good to have a utility method that actually follows a user. Similarly, it would be nice to have a utility method that will return true if one user is following another. Let's put those in here. Let's put these two utility methods here. Actually, let's save everything and run our test. Actually, let's run everything in this file. It's actually pretty fast. There we go. So we have two failures. We went following and followed, or actually follow, bang. There we are. So now we need to describe what the behavior of these things is. So let's go down to the end here. We're going to describe following. And let's think about what we want these utility methods to do. Well, if a user follows another user, then it should be following that user. This is actually an example of how test-driven development can motivate you to create utility functions that will then be used in the main application. So let's create another user. Now remember that this @user up here is actually just a user.new. It doesn't exist yet in the database. So we need to save it, and then we're going to have it follow the other user. The following won't work because it needs to have an ID to be able to follow another user. And so after following another user, it should be following that user. Here we're using the rspec Boolean convention. Under the hood, this is calling following question mark on @user. And there's another expectation we can express here, which is that its list of followed users should include this user that it's following. So we have two failures, but we can get this to work by creating a following relationship here. Let's quickly review the kind of associations we get when we have a has-many relationship. So here, a user has many relationships. That means we're going to get these kinds of methods. So these are the methods for microposts, but everywhere you see microposts, just replace that with relationships. We have all those same methods. So in particular, we can create a following relationship by calling user.relationships.createBang. Inside the user model, the user itself is just self. Self.relationships.createBang. The followed ID is the other user.id, and so this tells us what we're going to need an argument here. And we can ask if a user is following another user. This is true if the relationship exists between the two users. So what we can do is find by the followed ID and give it the ID of the other user. Remember, Active Record synthesizes these find by methods. If you look at the relationship model, you can see that we have follower ID and followed ID. So that's why we can do this. Let's rerun our tests. And there we are, now we're passing. I mentioned briefly before that unless you're assigning, like self.rememberToken, you can actually leave this self off. We can do this. By the way, here in the follow bang method, you can see why we use the bang. Follow bang just refers to relationships.createBang, so like createBang, it will raise an exception if there's an error. Having a working follow bang method suggests creating a complementary unfollow bang. Let's put that in. Since the user is now following the other user, we can nest it and test unfollowing. So we're describing following and unfollowing. So let's unfollow in the before block. Should not be following the other user now. And its followed user should not include the other user. The way to invert a create is simply to use a destroy. So let's find the relationship and then destroy it. It's the same thing we have here. And then we're just going to call destroy on it. And there we go. Now that we have a working followed users method on the user model, the next step is to add a followers method so that we can pull out a list of the users following a given user. I'm going to put it here just to emphasize the parallel structure with followed users. Should respond to followers. Now let's think about how we're going to do this. Let's look again at the diagram for followed users. Now if you think about what it means for one user to follow another, it's a one-way relationship. But there's the kind of symmetry to it, because if Alice is following Bob, that means Bob is followed by Alice. So if Alice is following Bob, that means that Bob will appear in Alice's user.followedUsers list, and Alice will appear in Bob's user.followers list. But all of the information about the relationship between Alice and Bob is in this relationships table. In fact, if you think about it, user.followers is essentially the exact same construction we see here, except with the roles of follower ID and followed ID swapped. Let's take a look at a diagram of that. So here we've just switched the roles of followed ID and follower ID. So if you take a user with ID 1, you can look at all the places where 1 appears in the followed ID column, and then look at the corresponding follower ID, and use that to construct a list of the user's followers. This diagram refers to a table called reverse relationships. And of course, you could actually have that be a real table in the database, but that's terribly redundant. What we really want is a way to tell Rails to use the relationships table just with the two kinds of IDs reversed. Let's express that expectation. Whereas we have relationships and followed users, we'll have reverse relationships and followers. So over here, we need to make a reverse relationships association. Let's see if you can guess it. Well, we've got a foreign key that's follower ID. It's right here. That's the foreign key that we're accessing. This is for followed users. Now, for followers, the foreign key is just followed ID. So let's comment these out and get the test to fail. And if we go down here, there are some other expectations. So if our @user is following the other user, we can reverse the subject like this. Let's make the subject the other user. Now, just as the user's followed users should include the other user, we can say, in this case, its followers should include @user. should have 3 failures here. There we go. Now let's uncomment this. Nope, we still have 3 failures. Why is that? Oh, there's a typo. I have followers with 1 L here. Let's rerun that. Still 2 failures, but it's some progress. And you can see here that Rails is complaining that there's no constant called reverse relationship. The reason that that's happening is because when we say has many reverse relationships, Rails is looking for a model called reverse relationship. So here, in relationships, Rails knows to use the relationship model. But in this case, there is no reverse relationships model. So we need to tell Rails explicitly which class to use. And we do that with a class name option. So the name of the class we want to use is relationship. And now it's working. By the way, you might recall that we had to use source followed here, because otherwise Rails would be looking for a followed user ID. In the case of the followers, because the ID actually is called follower ID, we could omit the source. Let's just comment it out here and rerun the tests. So you can see it still works, but I like to keep it there just to emphasize the symmetry between the two cases. This ends the main data modeling portion of this lesson. There's a lot here to digest, but probably the best way to understand the modeling we've done is to use these models in the context of a web interface to let users follow each other. To get started on the web interface, let's take another look at one of our mockups. Here's a mockup of the final profile. One of our tasks is going to be to make this here. These are some basic statistics about the user's following relationships. And as you can see from the mockup for the home page, it will appear there as well. So as you might guess, we're going to make a partial for that. And we're also going to make follow and unfollow buttons, as indicated here. As part of this, we'll also make the follow buttons actually work, both the conventional way and using Ajax. Of course, it's helpful in getting these design elements to work to have some sample data. In other words, actually have some following relationships in the database. So let's start with that. Here's our sample data rake task. It's fairly cluttered right now, so let's define some auxiliary functions to make it a little simpler. Define a make users function here and just put this in. This stuff here is just making microposts. Then we'll put in another helper to make relationships. Let's make a users variable with all the users. And we'll pick out the first user. And now let's somewhat arbitrarily pick a list of followed users and followers. So we're going to have the user follow each of the followed users. Because we have the Rails environment loaded, we can use the follow bang method. And we'll have some of the users follow the user back. Let's run these. Just make sure we're green. And while we're doing that, we can restart the server. Okay, so we're green, and let's take a look at the status of our application. All right. So let's get to work on that stats partial. Taking a look at the mockup here, we see that we've got two different links. We've got 50 following and 77 followers. Now if you think about it, this following is actually followed users, but we've adopted terminology here to be consistent with Twitter's established usage. So this suggests using the URL /users/1/followers and /user/1/following. Here's a mockup showing those actions. Of course, you're free to use followed users here, but there's no fundamental reason why the addresses of these pages have to be exactly the same as the underlying data model. And since this follows the established usage, I think it's clear to do it this way. Using these named routes here, let's write some expectations for the behavior of the stats partial. It will appear on both the profile page and the home page. Let's write the test on the home page. This is in the static pages spec. And so right here we've got describe homepage for signed in users. We have the feed here. This is the proto feed. We're going to actually make the real feed, of course, in this lesson. Let's describe the follower and following counts. Let's create another user. And let's have that other user follow our given user, the one that's created up here. And then we need to visit the root path again. Of course, we visit the root path here and here, but those visits happen before this following relationship is established, so we need to visit it again. And let's look at the mockup to see what the behavior should be. So if the other user is following the given user, that means that the user has 1 follower and 0 following. So it's following 0 users and it's being followed by 1 user. So that expectation can be expressed like this. It should have link 0 following. And the href should be following user path of the user. This will be a link to a page that displays all of the followed users. And it should have a link that says 1 follower. And that should be the follower's user path. So we've got 2 failures, and it's going to take quite a lot of work to get those to pass, but once we do, we'll have a lot of functionality. Let's start with the partial for displaying those statistics. Being app views shared. Let's call it stats.html.drb. Now let's think about how we're going to do this. We want these stats to appear both on the profile page and on the home page. Now it's tempting to have the stats just for the current user, the one that signed in, but that won't work in general because we want these stats to appear on the profiles of other users as well, as shown here. So on the profile pages, we actually want the user in question to be @user, as indicated here. So this is the user we want, unless we're on the home page, in which case we want the current user. So we can arrange for that like this. We can use @user, but if @user is nil, we want to use the current user. This construction might look familiar. It's what we saw in the sessions helper right here, and it can be made more compact using the or equals operator. Writing tests to verify that the stats appear correctly on the profile pages, both for the current user and for a different user, is left as an exercise. Let's make a div with the class stats for the purposes of styling. And that will make the two links to the following user path and the followers user path. We use the strong tag to display the link. Let's give it both an ID and a class. The ID is for the benefit of the AJAX that we'll be using later in this lesson. So this is going to be @user.followedUsers, and how many there are, which is just count. Remember, a count can work through the association, as we saw with user.micropost.count in the last lesson. So it's going to be this many following. And we can do the same sort of thing for followers. This is followers user path. ID is followers. And @user.followers.count. Now if you look at the mockup, this followers here is a label. So it's okay to say followers1. If you wanted to pluralize this properly, though, you could. You can just use the pluralize method. We first saw this in the error messages partial. Let's add these stats to the home page. We'll put them right after the user info, as the mockup requires. Render the stats. Now let's take a look at the status of our tests. Still failing. See if you can figure out why. Let's go to our actual web page here. Undefined method following user path. So this isn't surprising. Looking at our routes, we see that eventually we're going to have to define actions for following and followers. That will happen here in the user's controller. But for now, we at the very least need these routes. So let's put those in. This is going to go under resources users. And the way to do this is to give resources users a block. Now what we want here is following user path of 1, or following user path of a particular user, to be routed to /users/1/following. Because we want it to include the actual ID here, we have to use what's called the member function. Works like this. And here we indicate the names of the actions and the kind of request they respond to. In this case, they're both just regular web pages, so they respond to GET requests. By the way, if you want a URL like /users that doesn't include the ID of the user, you can use the collection function. So to list all the tigers in the application, you can do get tigers. But we don't have any tigers, so we'll stick with this. Let's refresh the web page. Looks like it's working. It doesn't look very good. But if we run the test after restarting Spork, it should work. And there we go. Let's get the stats to look the way we want them to by adding some CSS. Rather than type this all in, I'm just going to copy it from the Rails tutorial book. It's going to go under the sidebar section. Here it is. So we've got some styling for the stats class. By the way, you might notice that we have gray lighter here, which is an SCSS variable. We also have gray. This is actually part of CSS. If you don't see a $, it means it's just part of the CSS standard. We've also included a little SCSS that doesn't get used until later in the lesson. We'll use this once we get to the user following and followers pages. Save that and take a look at it in the browser. And there we go. That looks pretty good. See that they're links. They don't go anywhere yet, of course. But it's looking pretty good. Let's navigate over to the user's profile. You can see here that we're missing the stats partial. And we also want to have a follow form for other users. So here we want some stats, and then we want a follow or unfollow button, depending on whether the user is being followed or not. Let's make a partial for the follow form. This is actually only going to be on users pages, so we can put it in the users directory, app views users. Now we don't want the follow form to appear on the user's own profile page, so let's suppress it in that case. So unless the current user is @user, that is to say, the current user is the user whose page we're on, we're going to show the follow form or unfollow form. We'll give it a CSS ID. This is also for the use of Ajax. So now if the current user is following @user, then we want to show the unfollow form. Else, let's render the follow form. And of course, this requires that we make follow and unfollow partials. By the way, we're going to test these things by actually clicking on these buttons in the integration test later in this lesson. All right, let's make the follow form. It's a little bit tricky. So what is this form for? Well, this is a form for creating relationships between users. Let's look at the form for creating new users. We have form for @user, where @user, if you recall, is just user.new. So what we want in here is a form for a new relationship. And remember, the way we make relationships is through the association. So this is a relationship for the current user. And the analog of new for this sort of association is build. And we want to build a relationship where the followed ID is the ID of the user whose page we're on. By the way, you might wonder why we have an @user here instead of just user.new. And the answer is because we actually will re-render this form if the submission is invalid, and Rails fills in things like the name and the email. But in this case, there's no reason to create an instance variable for this new relationship, because we're not even displaying anything other than the button. So let's put in the submit button. We need a do f here. We need the form variable. This is in the 80th column, as you can see from down here, but because we can't actually get 80 columns in both of them simultaneously, it spills over a little bit. Let's put in a submit field. We'll call it follow. Now, if you think about it, we have a problem here because we have a submit button, but somehow we have to indicate the followed ID because we're going to be creating the relationship in the relationships controller, which doesn't yet exist, by the way. So we can send that information using a hidden field. I think it needs to be in a div to be valid HTML, but it certainly doesn't do any harm. So we're going to send the followed ID as part of this form information. Now, what's going on here is this f.hidden field is implicitly calling followed ID on this object. So this is a relationship, and this will make a hidden field with relationship.followed ID. So that's why we do need this here. We need to tell it the user ID. We'll save that and take a look at it in the browser. Let's find a user who isn't currently being followed. Just go to the last page. We're not rendering yet, so let's render that on the show page. So under here, let's put a section for the stats partial. And in here, let's put the follow form. Of course, it should only appear if we're signed in. We'll run some tests to make sure that it would catch that. I think it would, though, because current user needs to be defined, otherwise we'll have an error. Right, so here's the problem. The way this form for works is it infers from the class of this object here what the path should be. So over here, it knows to submit to /users because this @user variable contains an object of class user. So here we have a relationship, but we haven't yet defined routes for the relationship. So let's do that. We'll be creating and destroying relationships, so it's just like the microposts resources here. In fact, let's just copy it. Save that and refresh this. And there we go. Now we've got a follow button. So let's click it and see what we get. So it's so it wants to see a relationships controller. Oh, and I just noticed there are a couple of erroneous lines here in the routes. We've got these two get lines. These arrange for micropost create and micropost destroy to respond to get requests, and that's definitely not what we want in general. Although this does explain the mystery from the last lesson. Remember on the home page here, if we submit a post with invalid information, right now we just have a blank feed here. It's in the micropost controller. Remember, if we replace this with the actual feed, we get this pagination. So this is nice behavior actually to have the feed there, but if you click on the next page, we have this micropost create here. So now you know how to do this if you want to do it this way, but it's definitely non-standard to have a create action respond to a get request. So I'm going to stick with a more standard way to do things, which is to get rid of these guys. Now if we refresh this, we should get an error, right? And that's why in the original tutorial, I elected to just have an empty array here. So we get this. All right, let's go back to where we were. And now let's create a new file for the relationships controller. Alright, it just tells us that a template is missing. Let's raise an exception in here. The reason I did that is because I wanted to see the params here. We can see here that we have a hash, relationship is the key, and the value is another hash, which we can use to initialize a new relationship with the ID of the followed user. So you can probably figure out how we're going to implement following. What we'll do is pull out the user corresponding to this ID, and then use the follow bang method. Let's go back here. We've got this follow button. Let's make an unfollow button as well. Let's copy the follow form. In this case, we don't actually need any ID. We're just going to be destroying the relationship. So this is the relationship between the current user and @user. So what we can do is this. We can find the relationship. We do current_user.relationships.find by followed ID. Now we could use @user.id here, but @user itself works just fine. And then we need to tell it that we want to issue a delete request. This is a little tricky. The way to do this is with the HTML key, because this is going to be in the HTML. It's going to have method delete. This will be unfollow. And let's make it a different color. We'll just get rid of this button primary class. So let's go to someone that we follow. And there we see an unfollow button. Let's go over here. So you can see here we have method delete that issues a delete request, which is why we were routed to the destroy action. And we have an ID, which is the ID of the relationship we want to destroy. So now we only have two elements left to have a working interface. The first is to get these links to work so that we can go to following and followers. And then we'll get these follow and unfollow buttons to work. The following and followers pages will be virtually identical. Let's take a look at a couple mock-ups. So we see on the left here the users that John Calvin is following. And on the right we see John Calvin's followers. We'll plan to paginate both. And then on the left sidebar, we'll have a raster of small gravatars, so that if you click on one, you can actually go to that user's profile. In fact, there's so much overlap that we're going to use the same template for both of these. Let's see how that works. Let's write some tests here in the user pages spec. These are so similar, we'll just put them in the same describe block. So we'll create a user and another user. And let's have the user follow the other user. Let's describe followed users first. This is what we would call following. Let's give the page a title, following. Let's give it a smaller heading. Let's say it should have an H3. This is the kind of thing where you can make a good argument that specifying the actual H level is a little bit too much. If it broke more than a few times, I would just get rid of it or figure out some way around it. Now, the important thing here is that there should be a link to the other user, because this is a page of the users being followed by the given user. So it should have a link to the other user's name, and the href should be the user path of that user. Of course, all this assumes that we're signed in as the user and we're visiting the following user path of that user. So let's put that in here. Now let's describe followers. It's going to be very similar. Let's copy it just to get started, and then we'll make a few changes. Now, since the user is following the other user, in order to have something non-blank here, we should sign in as the other user and then visit the follower's user path of the other user. Because user is following other user, this user should appear in the followers list for the other user. So we should have this be followers, same here, and it should have a link to user.name and user path of user. I mentioned that we were going to use the same template for both of these. Let's make that now. It's going to be an app views users, and this isn't a partial, it's actually a full template. Let's call it show follow. Now the HTML here isn't too tricky, but there's a lot of it. We'll start by providing a title. If you think about it, the title is actually going to have to depend on which page we're on. So let's defer that to an instance variable, which we'll have to define in the controller. We'll call it @title. And now let's just put in this HTML. This is the raster of avatars. We saw the CSS for this earlier. This is a good use of the size option. This is a much smaller avatar. We'll link to the user, and we actually want to do this for every user in @users. Of course, I haven't defined @users yet, so see if you can figure out what it's going to be. It'll differ depending on whether we're showing the followed users or the followers. This render will automatically use the user partial. Let's paginate them. Okay, let's put this over here. And take a look at the user's controller. We're going to add a couple of actions to the canonical REST actions. Start with following. Let's run these tests just to see how they are. So it's complaining about the actions not existing, which is right. So if we look at show follow here, what do we need to supply? Well, we definitely need to supply an @title. So let's do that. Actually, let's run just the following test, these guys here. Okay, 3 failures. Missing a template, that's right. Okay, so it's not complaining about a missing action, but it is complaining about a missing template. So @title is following. @user should be the normal user. Just @user is user.find params of ID. @users, well, think about this. This is following, so @users should be equal to @user.followed users, and we're paginating them. And this is the key. Now we want to render the template. So the way we do that, we can see up here, we can render the edit template with render edit. This is just render show follow. And there we go. Now we've got passing tests. Let's take a look at the actual page. There we go. We can go to the current user's profile page to see what the raster looks like. There we go. So as you can see, followers isn't working yet. Let's run our tests here. This is just the followers test. But if you look at this, you should be able to figure out that it's almost identical. So in fact, we can just copy it. So @user is the same. The @title is just followers instead of following. Instead of followed users, this is followers. And we still want to render the same thing, so let's rerun the test. Excellent. You can see we can click on these icons in the raster, like that. Now there's one more thing I want to do with these followers and following pages. This isn't strictly required, but I think it's a good idea. We're going to follow Twitter's lead and make these protected so that you have to be signed in to view them. That's easy to implement. Let's go to authorization for non-signed in users and verify that users are redirected if they try to hit either of these pages. So this is for non-signed in users here in the users controller. So it should be the same thing here. It should go to the sign-in page. And for followers, it's almost exactly the same. And the way to get those tests to pass is just to add following and followers to this list of actions. You can actually see we are in the 81st column here, so it just fits. I am pretty obsessive about that. All right, let's go. And it's passing. Great. So now those two pages require users to be signed in. All right, now let's get these follow and unfollow buttons to work. This is going to be part of the description of a user's profile page. The actions are going to be in the relationships controller. It's going to be create and destroy. Let's get rid of this. The first thing we want to do is protect these guys. So let's have another block here for the relationships controller. As with the micropost, we're not actually going to have pages for the relationships. So we'll use post and delete. In fact, we can just copy these. Instead of posting to the micropost path, we'll post to the relationships path, and the response should be the same. It should redirect to sign in. And this will be the same, except we actually don't have a factory for relationships, and we'll never need such a factory. So let's just put in an ID here. Just hard code it. All we're doing is testing that it gets redirected. So if we say delete relationship path 1, this is a valid route, and so it should be redirected. So let's run these guys. All right, this is the kind of error when you have working routes, but you haven't restarted Spork. Yep, there we go. So that takes care of the security. And now let's find the profile description. We're going to describe the profile page. Let's describe the follow and unfollow buttons. Now we have a user from up here, but we need another user so that we can have follow and unfollow buttons. And let's sign in as the user. All right, now think about how we might follow a user. So since we're signed in as the user, we want to follow the other user, which means that we should visit the user path for the other user and then click on the follow button. So what should clicking on that button do? Well, it should do three things. Clicking on the follow button should increment the number of followed users for the user who signed in, which in this case is just user. It should also increment the followers count of the other user. And finally, it should toggle the text in the input field from follow to unfollow. So let's put those expectations in. And before we gave the change method the class, which was user, and we did something like this. We also did micropost. But in this case, it's not the user class, it's user.followedUsers. So RSpec automatically calls count on this object here. We want this to be changed by 1. So this should change the other user.followers count by 1. And we can describe toggling the button. I put another describe block here mainly so I can put the click button in a before block like this. So when you toggle the button, it should be click button follow. And this should now have an input selector with the value unfollow. We can take a look at the source of the page. So you can see that this is an input tag, and the value of that input tag is unfollow. So that's what we're testing for here. All right, let's get that to pass. We can go in the create action here. Now remember how this works. Let's find a user who's not being followed. So remember, the params has a hash to initialize a user. So what we want is this. We want to find the user with params of relationship of followed ID. And then we want the current user to follow that user. And then we should redirect back to the user's profile. The user that's been followed, that is. Now if you think about it, we've started at the user's profile, this @user, and we're redirecting back to it at the end, which suggests that we don't actually have to leave the page. And indeed, we're going to implement that idea in the next section. Also, if you think about it, there's actually no reason to have an instance variable here because we're not using it anywhere in the views, but we will in the next section, so that's why it's here. Otherwise, we could just say user equals user.find, etc. And it's a good idea not to use an instance variable unless you actually need it, but that's why I'm explaining why we're using it here. So let's comment this out and actually verify that we're failing here. All right, we've got 3 failures as expected. Now let's rerun them. And it's passing. Good. You can see in the browser here. Let's go back here. Click on follow. So you can see it incremented the number of followers and it changed the button. That's good. Let's get unfollow to work. The tests are similar. Let's go down here. Describe unfollowing a user. So before anything, we should actually have the user follow the other user. And then we should visit the other user's profile page. And now we have similar expectations to what we had before. In fact, let's just copy these guys. So we're going to click the unfollow button. So it should decrement the follow user count. So it should change this by -1. It should decrement the other user's followers count by -1. And it should change the input button from unfollow to follow. All right, we have 3 failures. So let's think about what's involved in unfollowing a user. So we see in the params here, there's an ID. This is the ID of the relationship. If you go to the unfollow partial here, you can see that this is a form for a relationship. It's current user.relationships.find by followed ID. So what that means is we can find the relationship and then destroy it. We could use the destroy method, but remember we've got an unfollow bang. So in parallel with this guy, let's find the relationship here. And then pull out the followed user. And then let's unfollow that user. And redirect to @user. Let's save that and rerun the test, so we should be passing. Let's go back here, click on unfollow. There we go. You can see it's toggling the followers and it's toggling the button. By the way, we see here that the word followers really is a label, which means that in the static pages spec, we should say it should have link 1 followers, which looks ungrammatical here, but in the context of the application, it looks fine. The reason this was passing, by the way, is because remember that have link matches substrings, so 1 follower actually does match 1 followers. Alright, so this more accurately expresses our expectation. So this is actually working. We actually have the idea of user following. But you can also see that there is a delay here. So in this section, we'll use Ajax to improve the user experience so that you can follow and unfollow a user without leaving the page. So you've probably heard of Ajax. It stands for Asynchronous JavaScript with XML. But in fact, it's always spelled Ajax like this. At least it should be spelled like this. So the idea behind Ajax is that you don't have to refresh the page to make a request back to the server. It's actually really easy to implement this in the forms. All we do is we tell Rails that we want the form to be remote. The way to do that is with remote true. So here we just do remote true. The same in here. So this automatically inserts into the page a little code that's necessary for Ajax to work. Let's refresh it and take a look. So this here, data remote equals true, is the key. This follows the philosophy of what's known as unobtrusive JavaScript. In earlier versions of Rails, it would actually insert the JavaScript right in here. But as of Rails 3, it does it unobtrusively. Now, we are going to write some tests for this, but testing Ajax behavior in general is very difficult. If you want to test the behavior of a JavaScript-heavy application, I recommend learning one of the tools for actually running tests in a browser, such as Selenium or Water. Water, by the way, is spelled W-A-T-I-R. My guess is that Selenium is the most widely used testing framework for this kind of situation. But it's a bigger subject than I want to get into right now, and the truth is I actually don't know too much about this. But I do know how to issue Ajax requests directly in the test, so that will let us test these actions here and verify that they respond properly to Ajax requests. So let's write those tests. Even though we're close to the end of the tutorial, this will actually be our first example of controller specs. These will be in the relationships controller spec. Let's make that now. It could be in spec controllers, relationships controller spec. Alright, so let's describe the relationships controller. And actually the syntax highlighting isn't quite right. I'm going to save this and reopen it. There we go. Now it's being recognized as RSpec. You can see down here in the lower right. Alright, so in this test we're going to describe creating a relationship with Ajax. So far we've seen that Rails supports relatively low-level tests using methods like post and put. It turns out inside of controller tests, but unfortunately not inside integration tests, you can use XHR to issue an Ajax request. So let's issue a post request to the create action, which should create a new relationship. So it should increment the relationship count if we issue a post request with the right form information. So we expect XHR post. The symbol here indicates the kind of request we're submitting to the create action. We don't need to tell it the controller because it knows it's the relationships controller from this. And now we need to give it the params. Now this is handled automatically when you submit something with the follow form and the unfollow form. And it's also handled automatically when we click the button here. This is one of the reasons that I prefer using Capybara whenever possible, is you don't have to worry about these low-level details. But here we need to submit a relationship with the followed ID. Now we need to have a user here and another user. So let's put those up here. And we'll have to be signed in. So what we want to do is have the user follow the other user. We expect this to change the relationship count by 1. We can also check the response code, which in this case should be success. HTTP has particular numbers representing response code. So for example, 404 is a standard error, 300 is a redirect, 301 is a permanent redirect, and success is 200. But RSpec has aliases for these. This one is optional, but I think it's nice to know that this is a possibility. It's the same thing here. Now we've seen this response object before. We've shown that it was a redirect. We've done things like this. But in this case, we're not actually redirecting. We just want to make sure that it actually responds properly. We can do that with B success. Let's save this and run these tests. So I said it was optional. It actually isn't, because you can see that it's actually working. If we post to that URL, it actually works properly, but what's happening here is that it's following through to this redirect. So what we want for this to do is not redirect. We want it just to respond with a success code, meaning that it re-renders the page. But we don't actually want it to issue a separate request. So when you redirect, it actually counts as a new request. Now the way to handle this is with what's called a respond to block. We want to respond to different formats in different ways. So let's look at this. We want to respond to an HTML format request, that is to say a regular web request, by redirecting. But if it's a JavaScript request, we want to do something else. And it turns out that the default here is to call a JavaScript file corresponding to this action. In this case, it's going to be called create.js.erb. So it's a mixture of embedded Ruby and JavaScript. Now this respond to block is potentially confusing. I think it looks confusing because it looks like each of these lines is being executed, but it's not. The way this works is that only one of these lines will be executed depending on the format being requested. So if you hit a web page normally with a post request, say, then it's going to count as an HTML request. But if it's an AJAX request, if it's an XHR, it's going to invoke this. So let's run the tests again. We actually want them both to fail, and now they are. Now it's complaining that it's missing a template, which is right. So let's create that. It's going to go in Views, Relationships, so we have to make a new folder. And then we'll call it create.js.erb. Now this needs to do two things. It needs to toggle the button, and it needs to change the followers count. Now this is the kind of thing that we're not going to test for because you need something more advanced than these kinds of tests, these controller tests or integration tests. So these low-level tests don't actually test everything, but they're good enough to give us some assurances that our application is doing the right thing. Let's look at the HTML for a form that has a follow button. So you might recall that we wrapped the form in a div with an ID that's in here. This is for the benefit of Ajax, because what we're going to do here is we're going to access that element inside the div using that ID. So what we're going to be using here is actually jQuery, and the way you access the HTML inside of a div corresponding to a particular ID is with a $, and then the octothorpe, or the hash sign, which is the same kind of syntax that you use in CSS. So we're going to use the ID follow form. Then to change the HTML, we give it the HTML method. So this might kind of look like Ruby, but this is actually JavaScript as expressed by the jQuery library. And then we're going to put in some HTML. So this is the section where we're going to replace the follow button with the unfollow button. And we have a partial for that. It's this one. It's the unfollow partial. So because this is a js.erb file, we can actually put some embedded Ruby in here. And so what we're going to do is render that user's unfollow partial. Because we're actually inserting HTML into a JavaScript function, we have to escape it out. And the way to do that is with the escape JavaScript function. And we can render the form. So that's the first thing we have to do, and we also have to change the count. We don't have to escape this out because it's just an integer. By the way, you might notice here that we've used @user. That's why we had an instance variable there in the controller in here. Let's save that and rerun our test, see how we're doing. There we go, now it's passing. In fact, if we go here, refresh, click on follow. Oops, so this is why you actually need to check it in the browser, because what we did there is we replaced the follow form with the number. We actually want to replace the followers, so let's take a look at that on the stats partial. So here we have an ID followers. So that's actually what we want to replace. So we're going to unfollow using the non-Ajax. And because we have remote equals true in here, in this unfollow form, it actually didn't do the right thing. I mean, under the hood, we actually did unfollow. So if we refresh it, we'll see it. Debugging Ajax is quite difficult because of things like this. And if you really get stuck, you can look at the server log. This will help you see which requests are actually being submitted. So let's click follow. So you can see that followers changed to 1 here. And this unfollow button, as we just saw, isn't working. So let's get it working. Copy this. It's going to be very similar. So this is going to issue a delete request to the destroy method. And it's going to pass an ID, which is just the relationships ID. And that should change the relationship count by -1. And the same thing should give a success response code. But if you think about it, this isn't complete. We actually need a relationship, so let's make that. Let's ensure that the user is following the other user. And we need to give it a relationship ID. So let's pull out the relationship. We can use the find by followed ID method. All right, let's run these tests. 2 examples, 1 failure. It's the thing we saw before. So it's actually working in the sense that it's destroying the relationship. So let's make a respond to block. the same idea. If it's an HTML request, we redirect to @user, otherwise it's called a JavaScript template. As you can probably guess, that's going to be called destroy.js.erb. This is just going to undo what create.js.erb did. In fact, let's just copy it. So the follow form will be replaced with the follow partial. And in fact, the second line is exactly the same because @user.followers.count does have the right count. Let's rerun the test. We should be green. There we go. Rerun the whole file. All right, so let's check out our actual application. Look at that. So you can see that there's no delay. This is executing a request in the background, so the application is much more responsive this way. Alright, so our application is in pretty good shape. All we have left to do is make a status feed. Let's rerun the full test suite before moving on to that. Excellent. To get started with the status feed, let's take another look at our mockup. Here's a mockup homepage for John Kalbman, and you can see that he's getting microposts from Thomas Hobbes, Sasha Smith, and from himself. The main task of this section is to construct this feed and display it on the page. Let's take a look at a diagram that explains how this will work. Alright, here's the diagram for the feed. On the left, we have the micropost table. Of course, each of these microposts has content and each has a unique ID. But what's important for this context is the user ID. So suppose that the user with ID 1 is following the users with IDs 2, 7, 8, and 10, but not following the users with IDs 18 and 9. In fact, this is exactly the situation that we saw in a previous diagram of the users followed users. I actually missed a user that's not being followed. This is 4 here. But you get the idea that the feed is going to be constructed of the microposts corresponding to the users that the given user is following. You see the correspondence here with the arrows. We've got the followed user's IDs and the user's ID itself. So the task of this section is to construct this feed. Now recall that we already have a proto feed. Right now the feed consists of all of the microposts of the current user. And we even have some tests for this. Our tests are here under describe status, where status feed should include the older micropost and the newer micropost, that is to say the 2 microposts of the current user, right here, and should not include the unfollowed post. Of course, we made these tests before we had the ability to follow users. So let's make another user that will then follow. Let's call it followed user this time. Now let's follow that user. And then let's ensure that that followed user has some microposts. Let's make 3 of them. Here I've created the micropost through the association. You could also use factory girl. I think in this context this is a little more convenient. So we've got the 3 rules on the feed, that the feed should include the user's own posts and should not include the post of an unfollowed user. And now let's test that all 3 of these microposts from the followed user do appear. So its feed should include the micropost for each of the microposts in this list. Alright, the way we're going to implement this is over here. Instead of micropost.where user ID equals question mark ID, we're going to have a custom method in this micropost model called from users followed by. So we're going to give it an argument, which is the user itself. So these are the microposts from users followed by the current user, which is just self. Of course, the micropost model doesn't currently have that, so we're going to have to create it. Now you can see that we're invoking this from users followed by method on the class itself. So this is a class method. We've discussed this briefly before. But there's a special way to define a class method. And the easiest way is to use the self dot and then the method name. Now this is potentially a little confusing because inside of one of these methods, self refers to the instance. So this here is a user object. But if we were to do something like this, self.feed, we wouldn't have a user object anymore. Instead, this self would refer to the user class. So it's just one of those things you have to get used to. So this actually is an instance method, so there's no self. But here, we have a self dot. And then inside here, we want to put the code to pull out the feed. We can actually replicate our previous functionality like this. Remember we had micropost.where user ID is equal to question mark. Before we had ID from the user model. Now we can do user.id. In fact, let's run these tests. Comment this out. Let's get these passing. Right, those are passing. And now I'm going to put this extra requirement in. This is the key. If we can get this thing to pass, we have a working feed. Alright, so it's failing, but this is a really good start. Alright, let's take a look at this this little snippet here. Instead of this being user ID equals the ID of the user, we expect this to be something a little more complicated, something like this. We might have it be user ID in some list, or now here we need as many arguments as there are question marks. So we've got this question mark being the user ID, and if we could somehow get, say, the following IDs, say the IDs of the users being followed, this would give us the feed. So let's take a look at a Rails console to see how we might do this. So let's review the map method. Suppose we've got an array, elements 1, 2, 3, 4, and suppose we want an array of those digits except as strings. So Ruby lets you do this. We have a block variable. We can call the toString method on it. It's 2s. And this returns an array of the strings. This kind of map where there's just a single block variable and the same method gets called on it each time is so common that there's a shorthand for it. We can use the ampersand operator and then give it a symbol with the name of the method. This is the same thing. By the way, this notation started off as an extension that Rails added to Ruby, and it later became incorporated into Ruby itself. We can also join these on comma space. And this is starting to look like a list of user IDs. So let's pull out the first user. Remember, we can pull out a list of the followed users. See how many there are. There are 49 of them. We can get their IDs by mapping the ID method using this notation. There they are. And we could even join them on comma space. All this assumes that this little snippet here which is actually SQL, or structured query language, supports something like in, where this is a list of IDs and we can check set inclusion using the in keyword. And it turns out we can. SQL does support this. It's actually case insensitive, but conventionally SQL keywords are written in all caps. So we actually have a way now of pulling out all these IDs. Let's do it. So instead of user.first, though, it's just going to be user.followed users.map, etc. So let's run our test. And look at it, it's working. So this is actually a working feed. Now there are a bunch of things that are ugly about this feed. So the rest of this section will involve refactoring this to make it a lot prettier. The first thing we're going to do is get rid of this join. It turns out that the question mark here actually automatically causes these IDs to be joined on comma space. And in fact, I've had it reported that this join doesn't work on PostgreSQL. So let's just get rid of it. Still passing. Another thing to know is that Active Record knows that you might want to do this. So you don't actually have to do the map. You can do followed users IDs. It was followed user IDs. Here we go. And this is short enough that we can actually just compress it down. So this is a pretty nice little implementation. It's quite compact, and this is a working feed. In fact, let's take a look at our application. Refresh it. And there we go. The feed is actually working. So even though this is actually fairly nice, there is something unfortunate about it, which is that this line here, this user.followed user IDs, pulls out all of the users from the database into an array and then inserts them as a string inside here. And this works fine when there are only a small number of followed users, but if you had something like 5,000 followed users, every time you calculated the feed, you would have to pull all 5,000 users into memory, or at least all 5,000 IDs, and then insert them as a string into this SQL. But if you know anything about SQL, you know that SQL is brilliant at doing this kind of set inclusion. And so as the final step, we're going to push this part into the database, so that even if there are thousands of followed users, this is still efficient. So first step, we're going to introduce a local variable. This is the one we just got rid of, but we actually want to restore it here for a reason we'll see in a moment. And now we're going to replace this question mark notation with keys. The way this works is that we now have a hash So what this does is it replaces this here with the value of the key in the corresponding hash. The reason we did that is because we're about to change this. We're going to make this into a select. So this is actually going to be SQL. I'm going to select the followed ID from the relationships table where the follower ID is the user ID. If you think about it, this is exactly what we were pulling out before with followed user IDs, except now we're expressing it in raw SQL. And so now what we want to do is just interpolate that in here. Because it's raw SQL, we don't need to escape it. So we can get rid of this. The reason we put the hash in is because we actually have user ID in two places. We've got it here and here. So this requires knowing a little bit of SQL, but it's pretty straightforward. And if we save it and run it, you can see that our tests are still passing, which means this is a working feed. So this is what's called a subselect. We have a select inside another select. Let's take a look at the SQL generated by this. Let's reload our console here. Let's pull out the first user. I want to suppress the printing out of the user. And let's call user.feed. We just want to see what the SQL is. It's weird that it didn't call the feed. It might be cached somehow. There we go. And so you can see here we have select count star from microposts where user ID in, and then we've got a subselect select follow ID from relationships where follower ID equals 1 or user ID equals 1. So let's just format this a little more nicely. I'm going to show you how this works. Instead of select count star, we can just do select star. This selects all the microposts. Where user ID in, we can use indentation to show the subselect, or user ID equals 1. So this is what's going on under the hood. We can actually make this just a little bit cleaner. Since this hashes the last argument, we can get rid of these guys. There we go. Now you may recall from the mockup that we actually want to paginate the feed, as we can see here. So let's put in the pagination. It's here in the shared feed, so let's look at the partial here. And it's in feed items, so we need to look in the static pages controller. Oh, and in fact, we're already paginating it. Look at that. Look at that. So it's working. The feed is working. Now, of course, this will not scale up forever, but this is pretty good. You can probably do this with thousands of followers. By putting the select in the database, this is pretty fast. So that's it. This is now a complete sample application. There's one more thing I want to show you. It's something that might occur to you. Let's take a look at the console here and do user.feed.paginate. Let's look at the, say, the 5th page. I'm going to suppress the actual output and just look at the SQL. And unfortunately that doesn't work. I'm not sure why, but let's just show the feed and scroll up. Alright, so here's the SQL. Select micropost.star from micropost where user ID and select follow ID from relationships. This is the subselect. Or user ID equals 1, so that takes care of the case where it's the user ID's own post. Order by micropost.created@descend. That's our default scope here. And then we have limit 30 offset 120. That's the pagination. So we see that the pagination actually reaches all the way into this method and ensures that we're not pulling all the users out of the database. That we're actually selecting only 30 at a time, and the offset 120 arranges to pull out the 5th page. So that means within the context of an application like this that's just running on a single server, we can handle potentially thousands of followed users and also a large number of pages. Both of them are quite efficient on the scale at which we're operating. So that concludes the sample application for the Ruby on Rails tutorial. Let's deploy to Heroku and see it on the live web. Let's run our tests. can push it up to GitHub. And now deploy to Heroku. Now we need to reset the shared database. Now let's run the migration on the server and populate the database. Now let's take a look at it. And there we go. Look at the users being followed, followers. You can unfollow, follow. And here we've got a feed. Alright, so we've launched the sample application to the live web, and this brings us to the end of the Ruby on Rails tutorial. At this point you may be wondering what's next. The last chapter of the Rails tutorial book has some suggestions for extensions to the sample application. These are designed to help you make the transition from following a tutorial to building applications of your own. So it's probably a good idea to try implementing a few of those features. In order to learn more about Ruby, if you're a relatively new programmer, I recommend Beginning Ruby by Peter Cooper. If you're more experienced, I recommend The Well-Grounded Rubyist by David Black. For learning more about Rails, there's simply no substitute for Railscast by Ryan Bates. Railscast includes a large number of free screencasts, as well as screencasts that are available by subscription. It's probably not a bad idea to subscribe to the Railscast feed for a while, but Ryan is so prolific that I think you'll find it's difficult to keep up. Instead, I recommend browsing through the episodes and finding subjects that particularly interest you. Finally, probably the best thing you can do to learn more about web development with Rails is to find a project that really interests you and implement it yourself. Before implementing any particular feature, I definitely recommend doing a web search to see if there's a tutorial available for it. I especially recommend looking to see if there's already a Railscast on the subject. There are a lot of great learning resources out there for Rails, and having finished the Ruby on Rails tutorial, you're now in a position to take advantage of them for your own applications.